More and more brands are beginning to engage in inclusive marketing. Now, that's a great thing because it means more brands are focusing their efforts on people who are part of traditionally underrepresented and underserved communities that are often ignored by brands. But not all brands that engage in inclusive marketing are effective or as effective as they could be. A big part of that is because too many marketers and business leaders think that inclusive marketing is just about the marketing, when in fact, it's so much more. So after this short break, we're going to get into the difference between inclusive marketing and what an inclusive brand is, why you need to be building an inclusive brand, and then I'm going to walk you through my 5C framework for how to build an inclusive brand. Did you know that most businesses only use 20% of their data? That's like reading a book with most of the pages torn out or paying for a coffee that's just 1/5 full. Point is, you miss a lot unless you use HubSpot. Their customer platform gives you access to the data you need to grow your business. The insights trapped in emails, call logs, and transcripts, all that unstructured data that makes all the difference. Because when you know more, you grow more. And when you get a full cup of coffee, you can do more too. But I digress. Visit HubSpot.com today. All right, so what's the difference between inclusive marketing and an inclusive brand? Inclusive marketing is all about identifying the many ways in which consumers are different, choosing which identities your brand will serve, and then intentionally incorporating those identities throughout every area of your marketing mix. And while inclusive marketing is the future of marketing, to get the kind of results you seek to achieve and to earn the loyalty of the communities you want to serve over the long term, it's important to build an inclusive brand. All right, so here's a definition for you of an inclusive brand. It's an organization that recognizes the many ways in which consumers, talents, and people are different and works to infuse inclusion throughout every crevice of the organization to ensure everyone the brand touches, no matter their identity, achieve success at the same rates. Inclusive brands produce inclusive marketing consistently. Now, why is this distinction so important? For one, it's what consumers want. I conducted the State of Representation in Marketing study, and some of the feedback from consumers that popped up over and over again was on this specific topic. Overall, the sentiment was that consumers will believe that brands are inclusive when it permeates through every part of what they do, rather than just in their marketing promotions. Here are a few verbatims of what consumers said they want. I wish brands can be more inclusive with every aspect of their businesses. Another person said, when you choose to represent different types of people, that inclusivity needs to translate into other areas of the brand. The brand also needs to be outspoken politically, have fair hiring tactics, etc., or people will realize that their quote-unquote representation is just pandering for sales. Another person wrote, I wish more brands understood that a diverse representation cannot be achieved by only one channel. Showing a mixed-race couple or a gay male couple in a TV ad is not enough. The brand should also incorporate the diversity into their hiring, their brand principles, as well as their public image. Another person wrote, it's more than just putting someone on an ad. They need to create products that cater to different people, hire people that are diverse. And one other person wrote, I wish they included more types of people in both their campaigns and in their actual companies as senior leaders. As I mentioned, consumers are skeptical, especially those who are part of underrepresented and underserved communities. They've been ignored by brands for far too long, who seem to suddenly be giving them all their attention all of a sudden, just because they want them to buy. One consumer that I was chatting with for another research project I was doing told me that kind of approach felt transactional and disingenuous. He described it by saying it felt like brands were adding in more representation in their marketing, thinking that would magically be enough to get him to buy. He felt like their actions were communicating, hey, here's a Black person, now buy my stuff. Another respondent that I was chatting with for another client research project told me that kind of approach felt transactional and disingenuous. Now, this particular person was a Black male, and he described it by saying he felt like their actions were communicating to him, hey, here's a Black person, now buy my stuff. Newsflash to that brand, it definitely was not enough. Building an inclusive brand is paramount to your inclusive marketing efforts, as it will help you establish trust with the communities you want to serve. All right, so how do you even go about building an inclusive brand? Let's walk through my framework. It's called the 5C framework of building an inclusive brand. So what's the first C? First C is company culture. And this applies, let's say you work at a large company with many different brands. This also could be narrowed down to brand culture. So think of company culture as the foundation of inclusive marketing success. It's because here we take into consideration critical components that set the stage for how your brand operates, how it shows up in the world, and the key decisions you make. Within this component of the framework, core areas to focus on include ensuring your mission, vision, and values have some elements of inclusion baked into it. This will help ensure that inclusion-based thinking is used as a means to help you make decisions. For instance, Michael Graves Design is known as the most accessible design brand and has been able to develop this reputation and diverse customer base because inclusion is part of their values. Ben Wintner, the CEO of Michael Graves Design, told me that accessible design is about the decisions you make within a home that are going to allow the widest group possible to live the way they want to live, and most importantly, with independence and dignity. I'm going to drop a link to the full episode with Ben Wintner of Michael Graves Design into the show notes. It was a really great episode with lots of wonderful insights. Okay, other important components of company and brand culture are building an inclusive employer brand that will enable you to attract and retain a diverse team that is representative of the people you want to serve. Inclusive leadership is also here because people on your team need leadership that can coach and guide them to think inclusively and to establish and nurture an inclusive and psychologically safe work environment. People need to have the safety to feel comfortable enough to speak up, to bring their identities to work, to dissent when needed, and add value in the ways a brand and consumers need most. And the last component of building an inclusive company and brand culture is all about measurement, professional development, and accountability. If you're not measuring how the team engages in inclusive marketing and making people feel like they belong, it won't happen. At the same time, if you're going to measure it and hold people accountable, they also need to have the appropriate training, tools, and support to develop inclusion thinking as a competency. All right, let's move on to the second C of building an inclusive brand, and that's all about customer intimacy. Now, customer intimacy, you've heard that term if you've been around here for any length of time. It is essential to your success in building an inclusive brand. That's because it provides you with a roadmap for inclusive marketing success. Most of the time, when you see brands having an issue engaging with people from underrepresented and underserved communities, it's because they have a customer intimacy problem. They just don't know the people they are trying to engage and serve well enough to not do it in a problematic way. Here are the components of customer intimacy you need to prioritize. Developing inclusive buyer personas and avatars, specifically defining the identities your brand is choosing to serve, and ensuring that your brand isn't excluding people by not being specific enough. In addition, cultural intelligence and identity-based insights are key. The more you know about the people you want to serve, how their plight is different from others who have the problem your brand solves, will position you to do a better job to serve them well. Another component of customer intimacy is long-term nurtured relationships with the community you want to serve, including organizations that support those communities. That's an area that a lot of people forget about, but it's a big component of making sure that people feel like they belong with you and understanding that you are committed to their community, not just committed to getting their credit card. And of course, data and customer success tracking. You need to know how you are performing over time, specific areas of opportunity for you, and what the impact of the work you're doing has on your business. Your inclusive marketing efforts will be more likely to get the support you need from leadership when it's backed up by data on how doing it effectively will impact your brand's bottom line. Data, profit, growth, conversion rates, market share, and sales, those are the love languages of senior leaders within organizations. So be sure to communicate with them about inclusive marketing in a manner that will resonate with them. All right, after this short break, we're going to come back with the remaining 3 C's of the framework to building an inclusive brand. All right. Okay, I've got another podcast recommendation for you. It's Augmenters, hosted by Julie Meyer and Jimmy Edgerton, and it's brought to you by the HubSpot Podcast Network, the audio destination for business professionals. So on this show, Julie and Jimmy dive into mentoring and explore ways to augment and refresh the mentoring environment. They're using 8 core principles that weave relevant spirit guides and diverse guests, and Julie and Jimmy use a lot of humor and practical tips to help mentors and mentees get further, faster together. There's so many great episodes to tune into for this show, but one that you might find especially interesting is their latest episode, number 120, Mentoring Across Gender, Men as Allies and Mentors. Listen to Augmenters wherever you get your podcasts. All right, the third C in the framework for building an inclusive brand is circle of influence. Now, inclusive marketing requires expertise to be able to execute effectively and achieve the results you like. And the manner in which you will get the expertise needed to do inclusive marketing well comes from establishing an inclusive circle of influence as a brand. Now, that includes building a diverse network. Data shows that most of us have pretty homogenous networks. There's even a scientific principle for it. It's called homophily, which really just means birds of a feather flock together. But if we only work with, learn from, consult from, recruit from the same sources, we're only going to reinforce our current way of thinking, operating, and viewing the world. So we need to intentionally work on building a diverse network of peers and colleagues and intentionally seek out a broader diversity of sources to learn from. If you're interested in this whole homophily study, it's really fascinating. I'll drop a link to it in the show notes for you so you can have a look. As part of inclusive marketing, it's also best practice to co-create with people who have the lived experiences of the communities you are trying to reach. Fantastic if you have people with those lived experiences on your team. For instance, when I worked at Johnson & Johnson, I was on a brand that made insulin pumps for people with diabetes. The team prioritized having some marketers on the team and actually people throughout the company who had diabetes and who wore insulin pumps themselves. Their insights and experiences were invaluable for us. But if you don't have that expertise on your team, definitely make a point to collaborate and partner with people who do have the identities and lived experiences and work with them closely throughout the process. And another important consideration here is supplier diversity, meaning you have a broad group of suppliers that hold different identities, so you can do a better job of serving people with the communities you want to reach. Consumers follow the money, and where and who you spend your money with is very telling of what your values are. So if as a brand you say you value inclusion, but don't spend with a sufficient amount of diverse suppliers, then it feels a little disingenuous. For instance, there have been more retail brands who have taken the 15% pledge, which commits them to dedicating 15% of their shelf space to Black-owned brands, which is roughly the makeup of the Black or African American population in the US. The 4th C in the 5C framework of how to build an inclusive brand is all about customer experience design. Life is about belonging, and because of that, business is about belonging. When the people you serve feel like they belong with you, they will reward you with their attention, their purchases, and their loyalty. When they don't feel like they belong, they will go off in search of another option that does make them feel that way. Customer experience is the vehicle with which inclusive marketing is delivered. Customer experience is actually what makes consumers feel like they belong, or not. So it's important to design a customer experience with belonging in mind. So this component of the 5C framework is all about designing for belonging, the destination for inclusive marketing success. Here, you're going to identify what type of inclusive brand you're going to be, because not all inclusive brands are the same. I'll drop a resource for you in the show notes that will give you more details about your inclusive brand type. In this phase, you'll also declare what your customer experience vision is, which is all about how you want people to feel when they interact with any touch point for your brand. There's also customer journey mapping, where you identify how people with various identities experience your brand, and the path they take with you to solve a specific problem. Now, I follow a gluten-free diet for health reasons, you know this. So when I'm thinking about going to a restaurant, my path of research looks different from people who don't have dietary restrictions. I'm going to go to the website and see what kind of options are available for me and what type of controls are in place, and possibly even look for reviews from other gluten-free people to see what their experiences are like. Knowing those aspects of my journey, someone with a dietary restriction allows a brand to design an experience that enables me to get my questions answered quickly and seamlessly. Another area of focus during this phase is figuring out where each touch point will fall on the inclusivity spectrum, because not all forms of inclusive marketing are created equal. I'm going to link to a resource for you that goes into more detail about the various phases in the spectrum, along with some examples. And one additional component to focus on in this phase is doing a customer experience audit or an inclusive marketing audit to evaluate how well the current customer experience your brand delivers measures up to the customer experience vision you've mapped out. That way, you can have a baseline and a clear action plan to help you identify areas of improvement moving forward. If you need help conducting a customer experience or inclusive marketing audit, definitely let me know. It's really helpful to get a baseline and specific recommendations on what you can do better moving forward. All right, and we have arrived at the last C of the 5C framework for building an inclusive brand, which is all about customer experience delivery. This last C in the framework is where everyone wants to jump to when it comes to inclusive marketing. This is where the actual marketing happens, or what we actually think about like the fun aspects of marketing happens. However, to be successful, you need the other components, which are all about building that overarching inclusive brand. Customer experience delivery, this is the vehicle for inclusive marketing success. To be successful in consistently creating inclusive marketing, it is important to have inclusive marketing policies and guidelines, kind of like your brand guidelines that detail how your brand shows up in the marketplace. To be successful in consistently creating inclusive marketing, it's important to have what I call inclusive marketing policies and guidelines, kind of like your brand guidelines that detail how your brand shows up in the marketplace. For example, that could include things as simple like for every video we produce, we include transcripts, we use Pascal case when using hashtags, or we use gender-neutral language whenever possible, and other guidelines for inclusive language. It's important to also point out authenticity here in this phase, because too many brands have been guilty of producing inclusive marketing campaigns that come off as inauthentic. And it gives consumers a negative view of the brand rather than a positive one. Consistency is core to inclusive marketing. You can't build trust without showing up regularly. And it's not a one and done type of thing or something you can only do during a Heritage Month or a day-long celebration. I have a client that I'm working with that did this really big, beautiful, wonderful campaign. And the people, consumers, particularly in the Black community, felt like the campaign was targeted at them and they loved the campaign. But their feedback was like, hey, like this is the only thing that we've seen from you that has been focused on our community. Like basically they were saying, we need to see more. This one campaign isn't going to be enough. Like we need to see that you're committed to us over the long term. Another important component is including culture and identities into your work so people can see themselves and or who they aspire to be reflected in the visual imagery your brand puts forth. And the last area of consideration here in this component of the framework is conversion optimization, where you are working to evaluate how your brand is performing with various communities to ensure that you are improving your effectiveness over time. All right, so there you have it. That's the 5C framework of building an inclusive brand, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, is really what consumers want. They don't want you to just engage in marketing tactics that are all about just getting them to buy more of your stuff. They want to know that you actually care about them and their brand and that you are committed to inclusion overall in the way you operate. So in building an inclusive brand is the way you go about doing that. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on this, on the fact that doing a good job at inclusive marketing and being effective at inclusive marketing means that you have to expand beyond the marketing and build an inclusive brand overall? Let's continue the conversation in the DMs, on social media, in email. I want to hear what your thoughts are as you wrap your head around that overall concept and the framework associated with it. If you like this show, I would love it if you would leave a rating and review for it in your podcast player of choice. It really does go a long way towards helping more people discover the show. Also, are you getting the Inclusion in Marketing newsletter? If not, really, what are you doing? Each week, I send news, insights, recommendations, resources, and other food for thought and just good gems to help you attract and retain a bigger, more diverse, and fiercely loyal customer base. Go to inclusioninmarketing.com/newsletter to get signed up. Also drop a link for you in the show notes so you can access that easily. Until next time, remember, everyone deserves to have a place where they belong. Let's use our individual and collective power to ensure more people feel like they do. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you soon.